The mall that never had a mall. Idaho, 1986 to 1988. The ribbon was cut in front of a building with no stores, no mannequins behind glass, no grand opening discounts, no crowds pushing through automatic doors. Just a low concrete structure on the edge of town, a parking lot striped too carefully, and a banner that read, "Welcome to Canyon Ridge Center." Local radio laughed about it for a week. The idea hadn't come from retail. It had come from boredom. Harlan Pike noticed it first. He was a civil engineer by training, a zoning consultant by exhaustion, and a man who had spent too many evenings sitting in parking lots watching people wait. For spouses, for kids, for something to finish. The waiting was constant. The consumption wasn't. Maribel Suarez understood it immediately. She had moved to Idaho from San Antonio after a divorce, carrying a background in regional advertising sales and an instinct for attention economics before the term existed. Where Harlan saw empty time, Maribel saw inventory. Their first meeting lasted 40 minutes. Their second produced a floor plan. Canyon Ridge Center had no retail tenants because it wasn't designed for transactions. It was designed for dwell, comfortable seating, controlled lighting, clean sightlines, cable television screens mounted everywhere, tuned not to channels but to rotating product showcases recorded off-site. No purchases happened inside the building. Orders were placed by phone. Three things made it work. First, cable television penetration had quietly crossed a threshold in rural markets. Second, catalog shopping had trained people to buy without touching. Third, zoning law categorized the building as mixed-use community space, not retail, keeping taxes low and expectations even lower. By late 1987, brands were paying for presence, not shelf space. The Boise Register ran a confused article, "Shopping Center Without Shops Draws Curious Crowds." The piece described retirees watching product loops, teenagers using the space as a meeting point, and sales numbers no one could verify. That last part was intentional. Maribel controlled the metrics. Harlan controlled the permits. When a national home goods network approached them about scaling the concept, they didn't sell the building. They sold the format, architectural plans, audience flow data, and a licensing agreement for passive retail environments. The building stayed. The checks didn't. In 1988, an internal memo at a Midwest media conglomerate referenced Canyon Ridge as a behavioral asset. The phrase circulated quietly. So did the money. Years later, when debt portfolios tied to failed regional malls began surfacing in secondary markets, one analyst noted something odd. Canyon Ridge never appeared. It had never been a mall. It was a pause. Monetized. Oil didn't reach the town, but money did. New Mexico, 1974 to 1976. The gas station ran out of fuel on a Tuesday morning, and by noon the owner had already sold the air. People came for gasoline and left with inflated tires, radiator water, coffee, directions, and rumors. The rumors were free, but they were the most valuable thing on the lot. Rafael Calderon heard the first one while changing a timing belt. "They say Albuquerque's dry, too." Someone else added, "Government trucks get filled first." No one said how long this would last, which made it feel like forever. Rafe had learned mechanics in his uncle's garage in Sonora before crossing north at 19. By 34, he owned a two-bay service shop on the edge of a town most maps skipped. He didn't own a pump. He never had. That decision, made years earlier because fuel margins were thin, turned out to be the most profitable restraint of his life. When the oil embargo hit, everyone wanted gasoline. Rafe noticed they also wanted certainty. His first move wasn't bold. It was administrative. He started keeping lists: who needed fuel for work vehicles, whose generators powered grocery freezers, which farms lost irrigation pressure after dark. Then he began calling people before they called him. Not with fuel, but with solutions that made fuel stretch. Carburetor adjustments, idle limiters, shared delivery schedules, makeshift storage tanks that met county code by a narrow margin. 3 weeks in, the town council asked him to sit in. The minutes from that meeting, later quoted in the Santa Fe Herald, recorded it dryly. Local service operator suggests coordinated fuel use protocol. What the paper didn't print was the deal afterward. Rafe didn't sell gasoline. He sold access. By late 1975, his shop managed routing for county vehicles, maintenance for private tank owners, and paperwork for emergency allocations. Oil still arrived sporadically, but money moved on schedule. Checks cleared from 3 counties over. He hired clerks instead of mechanics. A man from Texas drove up one afternoon and offered to buy him out. Rafe said no, then countered with something smaller, a licensing agreement for the system he'd built. No pumps, no fuel, just process. In March of 1976, a trade newsletter ran a single paragraph. Rural logistics models show unexpected efficiency during embargo conditions. Rafe taped it to the wall behind his desk. The embargo ended. The lines disappeared. The town went quiet again. Rafe kept the lists. Years later, when a man named Elric Vaughn appeared in a contract footnote during a multi-county settlement, Rafe recognized the pattern immediately. Neither of them had ever sold what people thought they were buying. The Quiet Paper Fortune, Vermont, 1978 to 1981. The fire burned for 9 hours, and when it was over, the town lost its past. That was the headline anyway. What actually burned was the municipal building, a red brick rectangle with poor wiring and excellent intentions. By morning, the roof had collapsed inward, the filing rooms were flooded, and the town clerk stood in the snow telling a reporter that most records were believed to be duplicated elsewhere. Claire Montreval knew that was false the moment she heard it on the radio. Claire was 31, born in northern Maine to a Quebecois mother and a father who had made a career out of being precise for other people. She worked as an independent records consultant, a polite way of saying she handled documents no one wanted to organize and everyone wanted to forget. Deeds, easements, old supply agreements, boundary clarifications written in ink that no longer held a color. She arrived in town 2 days after the fire, before the insurance adjusters and well before the lawyers. Her first move wasn't to ask for access. It was to ask who was tired. By the end of the week, Claire had purchased, legally, quietly, 3 truckloads of water-damaged records deemed non-essential by a provisional committee. The price was symbolic. The justification was space. The documents dried slowly in a rented barn. Over the next 2 years, 4 things happened. First, a timber company attempted to expand logging rights and ran into resistance it couldn't explain. Second, a dairy cooperative challenged a decades-old transport fee it had been paying without question. Third, a small electronics manufacturer scouting Vermont for tax advantages asked an innocent question about land use continuity. And fourth, Claire began receiving phone calls that started with, "We were told you might have something." She didn't sell documents. She sold clarity. In 1980, the Burlington Free Press ran a Sunday feature on post-fire recovery efforts. Archives slowly restored through private initiative. The article quoted a town official praising community-minded professionals. It did not mention the settlement agreements signed quietly that same quarter or the consulting fees routed through 2 law firms to avoid attention. By the time the barn was empty, Claire owned no land, no buildings, and no public-facing business. What she owned was a reputation and copies. When a Florida-based insurer purchased a portfolio of obscure municipal liabilities later that year, Claire recognized one of the analyst's names. She had seen it once before, attached to a footnote about storm risk exclusions. She clipped the article anyway. Paper, she had learned, did not burn as easily as people believed. And when it survived, it remembered everything. Insurance for things that weren't supposed to exist. Florida, 1982 to 1985. The hurricane wasn't supposed to turn. That was the problem. Every model pointed it north. Every briefing said, minimal exposure. When it curved west at the last moment, it didn't just hit the coast. It embarrassed a room full of experts who had already printed their assurances. By dawn, 3 neighborhoods were unlivable. By noon, one insurer had already begun paying claims. That insurer was a company no one in town had heard of 2 years earlier. Matthis held the clipboard himself, standing ankle-deep in salt water and insulation, checking policy numbers, while adjusters from larger firms were still waiting for clearance calls. He was 42, tall, severe-looking, with a German-Spanish name that suggested a story he rarely told. What mattered was that he didn't look surprised. Matthis had spent a decade as an actuary in Chicago, calculating probabilities for events that statistically should not coincide. When deregulation loosened the edges of the insurance market in the early 80s, he noticed something everyone else ignored. Policies were built around what existed, not what almost existed. His first product covered nothing spectacular. Detached pool enclosures, auxiliary power sheds, non-permanent extensions built temporarily for over a decade. Things not supposed to be there. The premiums were modest. The language was precise. The exclusions were narrow and unpopular with regulators. He relocated to Florida quietly and wrote policies faster than competitors could classify them. Four things followed. First, a tropical storm damaged hundreds of structures that standard insurers refused to acknowledge. Second, Mathis's firm paid out cleanly within days. Third, county officials began recommending his coverage off the record. And fourth, regulators began asking questions out loud. In 1984, the Miami Herald ran a skeptical piece. Are niche insurers exploiting regulatory gaps? The article quoted critics calling the model parasitic. It also included a photo of residents rebuilding with checks already cleared. Behind the scenes, larger insurers took notes. By late 1985, Matthis sold his policy portfolio, not his company, to a national carrier seeking entry into specialized risk markets. The price was never disclosed. What was disclosed was his role as consulting architect, a phrase that meant he kept veto power. When a file crossed his desk, the mall that never had a mall. Idaho, 1986 to 1988. The ribbon was cut in front of a building with no stores, no mannequins behind glass, no grand opening discounts, no crowds pushing through automatic doors. Just a low concrete structure on the edge of town, a parking lot striped too carefully, and a banner that read, "Welcome to Canyon Ridge Center." Local radio laughed about it for a week. The idea hadn't come from retail. It had come from boredom. Harlan Pike noticed it first. He was a civil engineer by training, a zoning consultant by exhaustion, and a man who had spent too many evenings sitting in parking lots watching people wait. For spouses, for kids, for something to finish. The waiting was constant. The consumption wasn't. Maribel Suarez understood it immediately. She had moved to Idaho from San Antonio after a divorce, carrying a background in regional advertising sales and an instinct for attention economics before the term existed. Where Harlan saw empty time, Maribel saw inventory. Their first meeting lasted 40 minutes. Their second produced a floor plan. Canyon Ridge Center had no retail tenants because it wasn't designed for transactions. It was designed for dwell, comfortable seating, controlled lighting, clean sightlines, cable television screens mounted everywhere, tuned not to channels but to rotating product showcases recorded off-site. No purchases happened inside the building. Orders were placed by phone. Three things made it work. First, cable television penetration had quietly crossed a threshold in rural markets. Second, catalog shopping had trained people to buy without touching. Third, zoning law categorized the building as mixed-use community space, not retail, keeping taxes low and expectations even lower. By late 1987, brands were paying for presence, not shelf space. The Boise Register ran a confused article, "Shopping Center Without Shops Draws Curious Crowds." The piece described retirees watching product loops, teenagers using the space as a meeting point, and sales numbers no one could verify. That last part was intentional. Maribel controlled the metrics. Harlan controlled the permits. When a national home goods network approached them about scaling the concept, they didn't sell the building. They sold the format, architectural plans, audience flow data, and a licensing agreement for passive retail environments. The building stayed. The checks didn't. In 1988, an internal memo at a Midwest media conglomerate referenced Canyon Ridge as a behavioral asset. The phrase circulated quietly. So did the money. Years later, when debt portfolios tied to failed regional malls began surfacing in secondary markets, one analyst noted something odd. Canyon Ridge never appeared. It had never been a mall. It was a pause. Monetized. Debt was the product. Missouri, 1989, to 1992. The first check bounced on a Thursday, which meant no one panicked until Monday. By then, half the town already knew. In the late 80s, default didn't arrive loudly. It arrived as delays, a payroll that slipped a week, a supplier paid in pieces, a bank manager who stopped making eye contact at church. When the recession finally got a name, people recognized it like an old acquaintance. Ilya Novak had been waiting for it. He was the son of Polish immigrants, raised above a bakery that survived on thin margins and precise accounting. His English carried no accent, but his thinking did. Conservative, layered, suspicious of surface value. After college, he skipped Wall Street and took a job no one bragged about, compliance analyst for a regional lender outside St. Louis. That's where he learned the truth most borrowers never did. Money wasn't the asset, obligation was. Ilya's first real move came after he was laid off. The bank folded 2 departments and outsourced the rest. In the severance paperwork was a clause most people ignored: the option to bid as an individual on non-performing microloan portfolios deemed administratively inefficient. They were selling debt for pennies because collecting it cost dollars. Ilya bought his first bundle with borrowed money and a lawyer who didn't ask questions quickly. The loans were small: appliance financing, medical balances, failed franchise fees, scattered across 3 counties. He didn't collect them. He categorized them. 4 things followed. First, he noticed patterns in default timing linked to employer closures. Second, he built a rudimentary scoring system using nothing more than spreadsheets and county data. Third, he resold restructured bundles, not to collectors but to insurers and municipal funds seeking predictable cash flow. And fourth, defaults spiked nationwide. The Kansas City Star ran a piece in 1991, "Secondary Debt Markets Grow as Banks Shed Risk." The article quoted economists debating morality. It did not quote Ilya. He preferred it that way. By 1992, his operation had 3 employees and no public sign. His revenue didn't come from payments. It came from resolution, settlements, write-downs, conversions into tax instruments. Debt transformed, not erased. One afternoon, a portfolio crossed his desk containing familiar fingerprints: insurance-linked defaults from Florida, retail-adjacent obligations from Idaho, municipal anomalies tied back to Vermont. Different stories, same residue. Ilya realized then that he wasn't early. He was late. Large firms were coming. Capital was consolidating. The quiet inefficiencies that had made him money were shrinking fast. So he did the only thing left. He prepared to exit. Debt, after all, was only profitable, while it was misunderstood. The last small-town exit, United States, 1995 to 1999. The business was sold without an announcement, a press release, or a celebration dinner. That was intentional. The wire transfer cleared at 9:18 a.m. on a Wednesday, routed through a New York bank that had never visited the towns it was now absorbing. By noon, the ownership structure had changed. By evening, nothing on Main Street looked different. That was how the last exits worked. Elric Vaughn read about the acquisition in a trade circular delivered 3 days late. He was 49 now, living outside Cincinnati, advising quietly and refusing anything that required a title. The notice referenced a portfolio consolidation initiative involving debt instruments, niche insurance products, and regional behavioral assets. He recognized every category. So did Rafael Calderon, who had sold his logistics software years earlier and now consulted for municipalities that still trusted him more than federal models. So did Clermont-Traval, whose name appeared nowhere but whose archival frameworks underpinned several liabilities now being quietly retired. So did Matthis, whose consulting veto had expired the moment the buyer crossed a certain capitalization threshold. And Ilya Novak, watching from Missouri, understood the timing better than anyone. 3 things had changed in the mid-90s. First, capital moved faster than judgment. Second, data replaced intuition. Third, small inefficiencies, the kind towns were built on, were no longer tolerated. In 1997, the Wall Street Journal ran a feature on regional consolidation: Wall Street moves into formerly fragmented markets. The article praised efficiency, scale, and risk harmonization. It mentioned no names from Ohio, New Mexico, Vermont, Florida, Idaho, or Missouri. That omission wasn't accidental. The people who had made money in those places had done so before money knew how to look there properly. They had worked in margins, timing gaps, definitions not yet standardized. Once those gaps closed, staying meant shrinking. So they left. Not together. Not ceremonially. Just correctly. By 1999, the systems they had built were invisible. Folded into national balance sheets, automated platforms, and policies written by committees. The towns remained. The stories didn't. No statue was raised. No documentary was filmed. But if you trace certain financial instruments far enough back, a municipal bond here, a risk carve-out there, a behavioral metric buried in retail analytics, you could still find fingerprints from places that had once been considered too small to matter. That was the trick. They had never tried to be big. They had only tried to be early. And in America, for a brief window between the 1970s and the 1990s, that was enough.